Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to introduce Dr. Rob Goldberg, who is the Professor Emeritus, Division of Epidemiology, Department of Population and Quantitative Health Sciences at the UMass Chan Medical School. He is going to be speaking to us on publishing your work. Dr. Goldberg, would you like to take it away?
Yes, thank you very much. Today we're going to talk about publishing your work. I sit on a couple of editorial boards, the most prominent one being the American Journal of Medicine, where I'm an associate editor. So I just wanted to bring some of my experiences to bear today with regard to publishing, and again, act as a cheerleader for you with regard to publishing. Okay, no disclosures. Good. So again, for those of you pursuing an academic career, which I had no idea that it was publish or perish. I actually never heard that expression before I started graduate school. I'm hopefully will take you through the ropes and nuts and bolts of publishing, because it's critically important with regard to ultimately getting grants, whether they're foundation grants, NIH grants, or whatever, to publish, ideally in an area of specialization, but if not, at least to keep publishing. And it also makes your academic life very interesting. So one key to successful writing is not to get bogged down with being perfect, because as we all know, perfect is the enemy of good. And I always bring the example of a nameless faculty member at UMass who literally could not share his work until he felt it was perfect. And as opposed to taking weeks to get a draft ready, he would take months to almost a year or two, because he wanted everything perfect. And I'm not saying just to write something down, slop it onto the wall, and then share it with your co-authors, but to at least go through the early machinations of drafting something up. And I will take you through that in the next series of slides. So let's talk about getting started with regard to getting your manuscript published and working on it behind the scenes. So obviously, with regard to a paper, you need to define your specific aims. Who's your target audience? And are you going to send it to a general medicine journal, a general public health journal, or a more specialty journal? Again, just as a ploy, if nothing else, to get you moving along with the paper. And we all have our nuances with regard to writing, and I'll share how I get my nuances writing. Outline the basic structure of the paper, and then consider 2 or 3 journals that you might want to submit to. And you need to really work with a mentor here to be realistic with regard to your journal selection. I can't tell you how many times I've had fellows in our cardiology division, who I work with extensively, come to me, and if they have a data set that won't get accepted into the New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA, they're clinically depressed and they move away. So again, work with a mentor. There's a number of journals out there. Again, the peer review process can be extremely uneven and unpredictable. But when you're ready, when you're thinking about the 2 or 3 major journals, it's also very important to consider the all-important word count. Most journal articles are between 3,000 and 3,500 words, mainly 11, 12, 13 pages double space. So that's pretty much what you're shooting for when you're talking about getting your manuscript published. So here, as each of you know, especially anyone that's published a peer-reviewed manuscript before knows, here are the major elements of the manuscript. The abstract, which is typically, for most journals, a 250-word structured abstract with 4 major subheadings: the introduction, the methods, the results sections, discussion and conclusions, and obviously your tables and figures. As anyone knows who's written before, the 2 most difficult sections to write are your introduction and discussion sections. And we'll go through those as a way to move you along with those sections. The key, however, with regard to, at least when you're ready to submit your manuscript, and just to give you behind the scenes what editors look at, they mainly look at the title of your manuscript, who the authors are and where they're from, and then the 250-word structured abstract. It depends, obviously, in the journal. I sit on the editorial board in the American Journal of Medicine. We see about 1,500 manuscripts a year, so we'll see about 30 on a weekly basis. And mainly what the editor does before he submits the manuscripts that he thinks the journal would be interested in, he reads just the title and the abstract. He almost goes no further than that. He's a full-time clinician. He spends a day a week on the journal. So you can imagine he moves through these manuscripts quite quickly. Sometimes he will actually read the introduction section, but more often than not, he reads just the title and the 250-word structured abstract. So if you're going to write anything well, write the title, prepare the title, and the 250-word structured abstract in particular extremely well, because that will grab the editor's attention or not. So now let's go through these basic elements in the next slide. So let's talk about the article introduction. In this introduction, which is typically 2 or 3 paragraphs, and you're talking double space, no more than a page to a page and a quarter. So again, the vast majority of introductions are 2 or 3 paragraphs, and they're no longer than a page to a page and a quarter. So what is the purpose of the article introduction? Establish the context, motivation, and importance of the research question in the study, independently of its results. So in the introduction section, as opposed to basic science manuscripts, you don't let the proverbial cat out of the bag, and you don't share your results. But the last paragraph is the key to the introduction. And if any editor will read an introduction, what they jump to is the last paragraph, typically in a 3-paragraph introduction, and those are your study objectives. And typically, most articles will have a primary study objectives and then 1 or 2 secondary objectives. And as I put here, if you don't do it, reviewers will do it for or to you. There's nothing to me more frustrating than you've worked with a fellow or a junior faculty member and you've gone through God knows how many iterations, 10, 15, 20, 30 iterations, and they've had it. They want to get this manuscript out. And the classic line they'll say is, I think we've gone far enough, and if a reviewer isn't happy with it, they'll rewrite it for us. And then, of course, the first thing out of my mouth is wrong. You need to struggle with it. You need to bring that marathon run to the finish line and submit, obviously, your best work. So here's the way the introduction section, and again, looking at the italics in the bottom, it should be about a page to a page and a quarter, double space in length. So you typically start with a general yet concise description of the problem that your study will address. And again, you need to think about, are you going in the case of the attendees, a general medicine journal or a more specialty journal? You want to reference prior relevant and salient work in the area, but not be exhaustive. And it really is good practice to not cite any particular project or paper in the introduction. You want to paint things with the broad brush stroke. Here, which is typically in your second paragraph, you want to point out existing gaps in current scientific knowledge and what have been the problems with prior studies that your study will hopefully fill those gaps in. So you typically will say buzzwords like prior studies were small in sample size, or dated, or failed to be generalizable, or were conducted only in one group, let's say in men versus women. Just be very careful when you're quoting concerns with prior studies that you don't fall into the trap of actually having those problems associated with your study. And then the key last paragraph of that either 2 or 3 paragraph introduction is clearly stating your study's primary, as well as, in some cases, your study's secondary specific aims. So again, you start with a general overview of the problem. I'm a cardiovascular epidemiologist, so the vast majority of my work is published in either cardiology or epidemiology journals. And depending on the journal, I can laser in, zero right in as to what the problem is under study, what gaps there are in the prior literature without highlighting any particular study, because I'm very careful there, because the studies that I criticize may actually turn out to be the reviewers of my paper, and I haven't started off on the right foot. And then I end with my primary study objectives. Okay, here's some guidelines by Ernest Hemingway, and I think he's right on with regard to this. Use short sentences, short first paragraphs, use vigorous English and be positive and not negative. Thoreau once said, simplify, simplify, and simplify. This advice certainly would improve most medical manuscripts, although it is ironic that Thoreau didn't follow his own advice and write simplify. So again, you're going to be talking anywhere from 5 to 10 iterations of a paper, and at least 1 or 2 when you really think it's in good shape before you send it off to a journal to have it peer reviewed. And again, depending on the journal, peer review can be very inconsistent. The way the process goes, the manuscript first goes to the editor. He or she will then assign it to an associate editor if he thinks there's something about the article that would merit publication in the journal. The associate editor then assigns, that associate editor independently looks at the manuscript, agrees or disagrees with the main editor, and then he or she finds peer reviewers to review this manuscript. Peer review process will take anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, and anywhere from 2 to 3 months later, you'll get a verdict about whether or not your paper is rejected, accepted with minor revisions, major revisions, or outright rejected. So the whole process before you actually submit a paper will likely take at least 2 to 3 months before you hear anything back from a journal. Okay, so it's very important to target those journals that you think would be welcoming of your work. And again, it's a relative crapshoot because you don't know. One thing you don't know is the backlog of articles that are in that journal that might also be in a similar topic. So you might have a wonderful manuscript, but the journal is just full of other articles in that area, and they just can't accept or don't want to accept anymore. So now let's go to the methods section. And what's important about this section, the results section, and the discussion section, in contrast to the introduction section, you should use subheadings here. And that you should have at least 3 to 4 subheadings. And the subheadings would be simply things like the study population, your primary and secondary exposures of interest, your study outcomes, and then you end that section with data analysis. So there'll be 3 to 4, even 5 subheadings in this section. So this section essentially recounts what's been done in your study. You want to give enough to the reader so that they can replicate the study if need be. You present a clear and logical description of your study design. Is it an observational study, a case control, or a prospective study? And what are my key study predictor and outcome variables? And again, as I've listed here, and this section is typically anywhere from as short as 1.5 pages to as long as 3 pages, you should have subheadings there. It, one, orients you, and it certainly orients the reader. This is also, when I'm drafting a paper, what I like to do, I like to start with my study objectives, which is the last paragraph of the introduction, and then think about what are the tables and figures they're going to follow. And then I go back and forth with myself. Am I going to go for the proverbial single or double, to use a baseball analogy, or am I going for a grand slam like the Red Sox failed to do against the Astros? So this is something, and I struggle with this myself because of course you don't know. Was I right in slicing and dicing this manuscript up or this data set into a couple of papers, or should I put everything into one and gone for the quote proverbial grand slam? But so what I like to do to get me motivated, I don't really like to think about the first 2 paragraphs of the introduction. I just like to go right to the proverbial jugular. And the 3rd paragraph, in which I state my objectives, then I make some dummy tables and figures, and now I'm motivated to proceed further. So what I will then do, I'll then go and work on my methods, actually ask our statistician programmer for data, put the data into tables, begin writing up the results, then be comfortable with the results, and then I start working lastly on the beginnings of the introduction and the discussion section. And the discussion section is where I typically gain about 5 to 10 pounds, because I write 2 or 3 sentences, then go to the refrigerator. Write another 2 to 3 sentences and go to the refrigerator. And I just go back and forth with myself. but I like to clearly use subheadings there too, because then I can start and stop and come back to a very targeted and delineated section of that discussion section and just stay focused on that. So the methods section, here are some examples. You provide the study beginning and ending dates, which always amazes me how few articles will actually quote that. What type of study design you used and the study setting, your data collection methods, inclusion-exclusion criteria, your key study predictor and outcome variables, and lastly, end that with the statistical analysis section. In your methods section, you do not put any results in the methods section. It seems obvious, but oftentimes, and certainly I see at least 2 manuscripts a week from the American Journal of Medicine. I'd say at least once a month, so out of those 7 or 8 journals I see, there are already results placed in the methods section. Some articles, it's a little hard to discern that, but you want to keep each section separate and distinct. Now let's go to the results section. And again, this is, again, a section that warrants subheadings. It will be anywhere from 1.5 to 3 pages, somewhat similar in length to the methods. And here's where you're stating your results. So in this section, you don't want to overstate the results or repeat in detail information in the text, especially numbers that are presented in the tables. So here, when I'm counseling trainees with regard to writing, I don't want to repeat in the text unless it's for special emphasis data that is shown in the tables. Okay? Typically, as an epidemiologist, I write about comparison groups. Older individuals compared to younger individuals, men compared with women. So when I'm talking about them, I want to allude to the findings in the tables, but not get into details. So for example, as seen in Table 1, men were significantly older, more likely to have a history of diabetes, and present with a first heart attack than women. See Table 1, okay? I don't put actual data in there to show that men were 68 years old and women were 61 years old. Or 15% of men had a history of diabetes, 7% of women had a history of diabetes. I want to allude to the data in the tables and use words instead and phrases to describe those differences. Another fault junior writers will do, they love to bewilder the reader with statistics, especially p-values, okay? When you can, you should use odds ratios in case control studies, relative risk and prospective studies, and accompany confidence intervals, typically 95% confidence intervals, professionally and intelligently, and move away from p-values. But do not get clinically excited if your p-value is less than 0.05, or clinically depressed if the p-value is greater than 0.05, because so much of that depends on the size of your study sample, okay? So you want to be very discerning and judicious with regard to how one presents their data. And what I like to have as a rule of thumb is to have no more than 2 to 4 tables and figures. Many journals now will allow you supplemental figures, which typically the reviewers will not look at, but it's just a place to park your data. So you should really strive to have anywhere from a total of 2 to 4 tables and figures, and you just review them coldly. You don't say as expected or consistent with prior findings. You just report the facts as is. Oftentimes the results section is too short. Again, you want to have it between 1.5 to 3 pages. Use subheadings. If you're doing a regression analysis, be clear what you're controlling for. Design reader-friendly and high-quality tables. Use graphs if you want to make your point easier. I like having tables. And only include the results in the results section. There is no additional interpretation or placing your findings in the context of the broader literature. You just report the facts as is. Here's your tables and figures. You can look at this in your leisure. Again, I like to, in my tables, take all data out to 1 decimal point. If I'm using p-values or point estimates such as odds ratios or relative risk, I like to take things out to a maximum of 2 decimals, statistically significant findings out to no more than 3 decimals. And I don't like to wow the reader with such precision for data that are inherently flawed. So really get to know one's data before one starts bringing one's findings out to 4 or 5 decimals and trying to bewilder the reader with findings that probably don't make a heck of a lot of sense. Typically, it takes a paragraph at most 2. You want to think about the appropriate statistical analysis using simple descriptive characteristic statistics, such as chi-square values and t-tests, to describe your study population at baseline, the classic table 1. And then, depending on what you're looking at, you want to do some type of regression analysis in which you can look at your key exposure in relation to your key primary or secondary outcome while controlling for various potentially confounding variables. And unless it's a methodologic paper, it's important to avoid the second bullet, in which you have statistical gymnastics and pyrotechnics, in which you wow the reader, but they get very, very confused or realize that this is not an appropriate manuscript for their journal. And this is also a good time to consult a biostatistician. So here's the most difficult section, is the discussion section. So here, again, similar to the methods, results, you use subheadings. The first section in which you don't need a subheading is don't rehash the facts, you state your primary study findings. The results of this prospective study suggest that blank is related to blank, okay? And then you can add on with your possible secondary study objectives. Now you go through your major subheadings, which will typically be 2 to 3 subheadings in the results section, and place the results of your study in the context of the broader literature. So irrespective of your findings, and hopefully they're consistent with the prior literature, if not, that's fine, and you discuss reasons why they're different from the prior literature. Here, I don't like to name drop. So I don't like to say Goldberg et al. And Farmer et al. Or Lovelock et al. Found this. I don't care about those 3 authors in particular, but I care about what their study population was. So in a study of heart attack survivors in the Worcester metropolitan area, the investigators found the following. So when you're citing prior work, talk about the study population and their findings as opposed to name dropping. Name dropping isn't a good thing to do. And as you go through this section, you want to place your findings in the context of the broader literature. If they're consistent, great. If they're not, you try to explain why. And the other key finding here is at the very bottom in italics, do not discuss any findings that you didn't present in the results section. This is not the time to introduce new data, okay? So any and everything that you should have covered should have been done a priori in the results section and not introduced de novo in the discussion section. The other thing, as you're going through your subheading, which investigators typically do, is after you've gone through your major subheadings and placed the context, the results of your study in the context of the prior literature, you do bullet 3. You summarize your study strengths and limitations, or study strengths and weaknesses. I can't tell you how many times people just talk about their study limitations or nothing at all, which is equally bad, and then they'll air all their dirty laundry. And that's not a good thing to do. And I'm not trying to be scientifically dishonest, but you can be scientifically cozy, because what you don't want to do is highlight a weakness that the reviewer might not have thought about before, and then you expose yourself, and then all of a sudden the reviewer who liked your paper doesn't like your paper anymore. So what you want to do is find 3 to 4 study strengths, 3 to 4 study weaknesses, and incorporate it all in a paragraph. You shouldn't go into 2 to 3 paragraphs for this unless it's a little methodologically type paper, and then you end with your conclusions. And again, you avoid conclusions not supported by results, and do not discuss findings that you did not present in your results. And do not end with the kiss of death that further research into this topic is needed. Okay, that's a great way to have your paper rejected. Again, describe any new information your paper provides. Anticipate and avoid the most common reviewer criticism. This is nothing new. and speculate intelligently and avoid gross misstatements or induced speculation why you found what you did. And again, be careful and cautious here, because even though your findings may be consistent with the prior literature, that doesn't mean the next day or a year or two from now, those results are going to be thrown out the window because of some new findings that have been discovered. Okay? So again, you want to speculate to an extent and be very careful with regard to the interpretation of one's findings. So again, you want to highlight your study's strengths and limitations. And again, be very careful here. You'd like to emphasize some 3 to 4 strengths. You have a large representative sample. Your predictor and outcome variables were carefully measured and independently validated. Your study results are generalizable because you studied a random sample of the United States population. And then you quietly discuss your study limitations so that you acknowledge them, but you don't harp on them or extensively discuss them. When you get to the discussion section, which can be very long-winded, you should keep it short. Reviewers and editors report that the discussion section typically is too long, rambles, and is often flawed. And this is good to know because this is the section that we all have the most difficult time writing. Also, do not force the reviewer to say the discussion section should be considerably shortened. I always love sending my work to the American Journal of Cardiology. The editor there likes to have the discussion section be less than a page. And I think if he had his way, he'd have the whole discussion section be a paragraph or 2. Most discussion sections are 2 to 3 pages, but people can be incredibly long-winded. So again, it should be anywhere from 2 to 3 pages, and ideally try to stick to those limits. You want to always provide cautious conclusions that are supported by your data. Conclusions must be drawn from the data presented. Polish your conclusions to avoid the criticism that the authors need to be more conservative and thoughtful in their interpretation of the data. I'm always concerned when someone says our findings demonstrate as opposed to suggest, let's say. And even if your conclusions are correct, if they are not consistent with the evidence in your results, your paper probably will be rejected. Okay? So you want to be very cautious, and you'll see some of the wording, I think, in the next slide with regard to how to state these findings. So in your conclusions and in your discussion, be modest. When you describe your study or a finding with the words the first, only, or largest series, modesty requires that you add known to us. So there's nothing to me that's more aggravating than our findings demonstrate or strongly suggest the following. I like to be more modest in my writing and conservative there, which is not inherent to my nature. But I realize the strengths and limitations of the data set. I realize these findings may be turned on their head by subsequent manuscripts, and maybe what I found would not be replicated in other settings for a variety of reasons. And you can write things like, we are aware of no published reports that describe the following. So again, be very cautious and careful and modest in both your discussion section and in your conclusions, and let the reader come up with their own assessment of what you found. And again, introduce nothing new in the discussion section. Everything goes in the results section before, and you only can discuss the findings that you have in fact uncovered. You want to describe your findings with appropriate balance. You use words such as proves cautiously. Indicates or suggests is usually more appropriate. Phrases such as solves an important problem are too enthusiastic and therefore inappropriate. Do not overstate the importance of your findings, and you want to strike balance. You also, if you come up with something new and exciting, you don't want to understate it either. You simply show the evidence, discuss it, but remain objective and understated. Okay? Especially if this is a new and novel finding and others have not presented similar work that you can compare your findings to. So finally, in the conclusions, you want to conclude with a bolt of lightning. In the, as I say in the first bullet, the body of a good paper is a thunderbolt in reverse. It begins with thunder in the introduction section and ends with lightning. Quality papers end with strong and clear conclusions. Clearly state your recommendations based on your findings, and do not end your discussion with the killer statement that more research is needed. Your summary statement, usually the final sentence in the discussion, must capture what is important about your study. Remember that most people read the abstract, the conclusions, and then the introduction, typically in that order. Editors will read the title and the abstract, and at most the end of the introduction section, your study objectives, and that will be it. So again, you want to gain the reader's attention and be very obviously careful and not overstate your findings. So here's the last part of your manuscript, which is typically for most journals either 200, 250, or 300 word abstract. The vast majority of journals want a 250 word structured abstract. So you write this as the last section of the manuscript, but write it well. You're going to sink or swim with most editors there as they read the abstract. Describe the problem clearly in the first sentence in your study objectives. Explain how you conducted the study and describe important results and conclusions. Present quantitative results, but don't waste a lot of words on methods there. In other words, you could say, for example, if you did a regression analysis, you control for a variety of demographic and clinical variables, and you don't need to list each one. Okay, that's pretty much a waste of space. And again, avoid, if possible, and it's easier said than done, using same sentences in the abstract as they are in the body of the paper. All right, you try to break up the cadence and you use a similar terminology. Don't just lift everything from the body of the paper and put in the abstract. And you should absolutely spend considerable amount of time writing this, writing it last, and writing it best. Here's the aspects, elements of a good title, easy to understand. It promises the paper's content. It should be at most 10 to 12 words long, and ideally it should be interesting and eye-catching. Even if you're a relatively quiet, introverted person and you don't like to have attention called to you, try to come up with something a little eye-catching that doesn't overstate your findings, but will grab an editor's attention. I remember one of the first articles I wrote was we had done not a meta-analysis, but a summary overview of whether or not patients with a heart attack should receive anticoagulants in the hospital. And the title was to anticoagulate or not to anticoagulate in the setting of acute myocardial infarction. And I thought that was extremely Shakespearean. And that was about as exciting and dramatic a title as I've ever come up with. So when you submit your article to a journal, and again, be thoughtful and work with your mentor in identifying a journal, because it's going to take at least 2 to 3 months before you get feedback. Some journals, which is fine, will reject your paper outright in 24 hours, and that's humbling, but that's okay. You'd rather hear sooner rather than later. So what's a good article? One that makes the reader wonder, why the heck didn't I think of that? It deals with an important, interesting, and contemporary topic. The study aims are clearly stated, the methodology is rigorous, the data are well presented and interpreted, and the discussion is concise and interesting. It's relevant to the target audience of that journal, and boy, wouldn't it be great if we could each do original research as opposed to Me Too type research. So again, definition of a good article and answers and addresses a specific question that ideally hasn't been addressed before. Talks about the strengths and limitations of the study design and your findings. It's tight, it's clear, it's very succinct and well organized, clear and easy to read, and it omits irrelevant points. It doesn't say, you know, as expected or consistent with numerous studies in this well-published area. You want to review or eliminate extraneous phrasing. And here, just to give you a little chuckle, here's some scientific jargon that you'll hear constantly that I hope I avoided in today's talk. That you'll hear some high-powered academic come to the institution. Here's the quote, and here's the translation. And I always love the first couple. Has long been known, which means I didn't bother to look up the original reference, or a definite trend is evident. These data are practically meaningless. and there'll be some others that will give you a lukewarm chuckle as we end. You know, as best I can recommend to the group here, it can be a very slow process. It can be a slog. And until you get your first couple of papers out, it will be challenging. But you will find the best times that you write is in the morning, late afternoon, early in the evening, late in the evening. And start with your study objectives. Think about your tables and figures, and then go back to your methods, and then you're on your way. You know, to write the first paragraph or two of the introduction can be challenging, and certainly to write the discussion section is typically highly challenging. So if you focus on those three areas, the last section of the objectives, your study, your objectives in your introduction section, your tables and figures, and then the methods, you're on your way. And before you realize it, you've got a paper that you can send out to your peers. And one last thing, if you can find one peer who will be a good editor and a good writer with you, aside from whether or not they're, you know, a great collaborator in terms of doing the actual research, hold them precious. It's extremely difficult to find investigators who are willing to edit and go through your paper. You know, it doesn't help to have a group of Me Too's or people that just agree with everything you write. You know, this looks great, or geez, it's too bad that this couldn't get in the New England Journal of Medicine, whatever. You want to get concrete feedback. And the more you can find those people, latch on to them, because they're very difficult to find, and hold them near and dear to you.